He was Hitler's ally, Europe's first fascist dictator, a man who built his power on spectacle, loyalty, and fear. But what Mussolini did to the people who ended up in his prisons and camps is a story that has never received the attention it deserves. Some of it shocked even the regimes that stood beside him. Most people, when they think of Mussolini's Italy, think of the bombastic speeches, the Roman salutes, the alliance with Nazi Germany. What they don't think about is the machinery he built, quietly, methodically, and years before the war, to deal with anyone who stood in his way. Benito Mussolini came to power in 1922, when King Victor Emmanuel III invited him to form a government following the March on Rome. Within 3 years, Italy was a one-party state. Opposition parties were dissolved, a free press ceased to exist, and a dedicated security apparatus, the OVRA, the secret police, was established to hunt, monitor, and neutralize anyone the regime classified as an enemy. The OVRA infiltrated political organizations, labor unions, exile communities abroad, and even Catholic Church networks. Suspects were followed, their mail intercepted, their telephone calls monitored. Italy under Mussolini developed one of the most extensive domestic surveillance systems in interwar Europe. What happened to those the OVRA identified depended on the severity of the regime's judgment. The mildest outcome was a formal warning. The next step was Confino, a system of internal exile formalized in 1926 that became one of the defining instruments of fascist repression. Under Confino, individuals deemed dangerous were removed from their homes and forced to live under police supervision in remote locations, typically small towns in southern Italy or on the islands of Lipari, Ventotene, and Ponza. They could not leave their designated area. They reported to the local carabinieri at regular intervals, were financially dependent on an inadequate state stipend, and were cut off from their professional networks, their families, and any ability to continue political activity. The Confino system held tens of thousands of Italians over Mussolini's rule: communists, socialists, liberals, Catholic anti-fascists, intellectuals, and ordinary people who had said the wrong thing. Some spent years there, some spent decades. The psychological toll of sustained isolation and enforced idleness under constant supervision was as damaging as any physical punishment. But Confino was the gentler face of the system. For those the regime deemed truly dangerous, there were the prisons, and what happened inside them was a different matter entirely. The Italian prison system under fascism inherited the institutions of the liberal state that preceded it and transformed them. The transformation was not always architectural. Many of the same buildings remained in use, but it was profound in how they operated and what they were used for. Political prisoners in Mussolini's Italy existed in a legal gray zone from the beginning. The Special Tribunal for the Defense of the State, established in 1926, was a military court operating outside the normal civilian legal system. Its judges were military officers and fascist party officials, not independent jurists. Defendants had limited rights, limited access to legal representation, and faced a court that operated on an assumption of guilt. In its 20 years of operation, the Special Tribunal sentenced more than 13,000 people and carried out more than 40 death sentences. Among its most prominent victims was Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist philosopher and founding member of the Italian Communist Party, sentenced in 1928 to more than 20 years in prison. The prosecutor stated that the court's purpose was to stop that brain from functioning for 20 years. Gramsci was imprisoned at Turi, near Bari. His health, already fragile at sentencing, deteriorated steadily. He suffered from tuberculosis, arterial disease, and other conditions that were inadequately treated despite his family's repeated requests for proper medical care. When conditionally released in 1937, he was dying. He died in a clinic in Rome on April 27, 1937, just days after his release, at 46 years old. Gramsci's case became the most internationally visible example of what the Italian fascist prison system did to political prisoners, but he was far from alone. Consistent features across political detention facilities included inadequate food, restricted reading material, limited outdoor exercise, deliberately insufficient medical care, and constant surveillance designed to erode the prisoner's sense of self and connection to the outside world. Some prisoners faced direct physical violence, beatings by guards or fellow prisoners coerced by prison authorities. Solitary confinement was used routinely as a pressure tool, and the deliberate withholding of information about events in the outside world, about family members, about the prisoner's own legal situation, was systematic rather than incidental. As the regime expanded its reach into Africa and then into the broader European conflict, the methods developed domestically were exported and applied at a scale the Confino camps and domestic prisons had never reached. Before most people think of Mussolini's crimes, they think of World War II. But the most systematic mass atrocities carried out under his rule did not occur in Europe. They occurred in Africa, specifically in Libya, which had been an Italian colony since 1911, and they preceded the European war by nearly a decade. In 1929, Mussolini appointed Pietro Badoglio as Governor-General of Libya with instructions to finally pacify the region, which had been under intermittent armed resistance since the Italian conquest began. Badoglio, in turn, delegated the military campaign to General Rodolfo Graziani, who would go on to become one of the most significant figures in the history of Italian colonial violence. The resistance Graziani was tasked with destroying was centered in the eastern Libyan region of Cyrenaica, and was led primarily by the Senussi, a Muslim religious and political movement that had been fighting Italian rule for nearly 2 decades. By 1930, the resistance was weakening, but not broken. What Graziani implemented to finish it was a strategy that had no precedent in Italian military history, and few precedents anywhere: the systematic removal and imprisonment of the entire civilian population of the Cyrenaican interior. Between 1930 and 1931, approximately 100,000 Libyan civilians, men, women, and children, were forcibly removed from their homes and agricultural lands and relocated to a series of concentration camps established in the coastal lowlands. The official Italian reasoning was that the civilian population was providing support to the resistance fighters and that separating them from the countryside would cut off that support. The actual effect, and to a significant degree, the actual intent, was to destroy the social and economic fabric of Cyrenaican life entirely. The camps were not equipped to support the population they were forced to hold. Food was inadequate, water was insufficient, medical care was essentially non-existent. The Libyan population that had been relocated were pastoral nomads and farmers whose entire way of life had been built around movement, land, and their herds. In the camps, their animals were confiscated or died. Their traditional social structures were disrupted, and the mortality rate rapidly became catastrophic. Between 1930 and 1933, approximately half of the entire Cyrenaican camp population died, roughly 50,000 people, out of a total camp population that had itself represented a significant fraction of the entire regional population. The deaths came from starvation, disease, and the general collapse of conditions that the Italian administration either could not or chose not to remedy. Eyewitness accounts from Italian administrators present during the camp period documented the conditions in terms that left no doubt about what was occurring, even as official communications to Rome described the situation in more measured language. Omar Mukhtar, the Senussi resistance leader who had become the primary symbol of Libyan resistance to Italian rule, was captured by Italian forces in September 1931. He was 73 years old. He was tried before a military tribunal, a proceeding that lasted 1 day, and sentenced to death. He was publicly hanged at the Suluk concentration camp on September 16, 1931, in front of thousands of Libyan prisoners who had been assembled specifically to witness the execution. Italian authorities photographed and filmed the hanging. The image of Mukhtar being led to the gallows, old and dignified in the face of what was being done to him, became one of the enduring photographs of colonial brutality. The camp system in Cyrenaica was wound down after Mukhtar's execution, as the remaining resistance effectively collapsed. But the human cost of what had been done there, the deaths, the displacement, the destruction of an entire regional society, was not something that could be undone. And the methods Graziani had used in Libya would shape his approach when he was given command again in later conflicts. If Libya represented the systematic destruction of a civilian population through imprisonment and deprivation, Ethiopia represented something different: the use of weapons prohibited under international law against both military and civilian populations, and the management of prisoners in ways that explicitly rejected any legal framework for their treatment. Italy invaded Ethiopia in October 1935 under the command of Pietro Badoglio, the same man who had overseen the Libya campaign. The Ethiopian military, equipped primarily with World War I-era weapons and no air force, was facing the Italian military with its modern artillery, tanks, and aircraft. Despite this enormous disparity, Ethiopian resistance was fierce and sustained in a way that Italian planners had not fully anticipated. The Italian response to resistance, both military and civilian, rapidly escalated beyond conventional warfare. Mustard gas and phosgene, chemical weapons explicitly prohibited by the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which Italy had signed, were deployed by Italian aircraft against Ethiopian military formations, civilian populations, and Red Cross medical facilities. The use of chemical weapons against Red Cross facilities was not accidental. Italian aircraft specifically targeted hospitals and aid stations, marked with the Red Cross symbol on multiple documented occasions. Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian emperor who led his country's defense and would later address the League of Nations in Geneva, in an appeal that became one of the most famous speeches of the interwar period, described in detail the effect of the chemical attacks on his forces and his civilian population. The speech, delivered in June 1936 after Ethiopia had fallen, was a direct accusation against Italy before an international body, and the League of Nations, despite having the documented evidence of Italy's chemical weapons use, did nothing that materially changed the outcome. The treatment of Ethiopian prisoners captured during the Italian campaign and in the subsequent occupation was not governed by any framework the Italian military chose to recognize. Ethiopian fighters who were captured were frequently not treated as prisoners of war in any meaningful sense. Summary executions of captured combatants were documented extensively, carried out by Italian troops and by the Eritrean colonial troops, known as Askari, who served alongside Italian forces, and were sometimes directed by Italian officers in the conduct of reprisals. The most severe single event in the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, the Addis Ababa massacre of February 1937, was triggered by an assassination attempt on Rodolfo Graziani, who had been appointed Viceroy of Italian East Africa after Badoglio's departure. On February 19, 1937, 2 Ethiopian men threw grenades at Graziani during a public celebration, wounding him along with several other Italian officials. Graziani's response was immediate and directed at the entire Ethiopian civilian population of the capital. Italian forces and fascist civilian militia members who had accompanied them, members of the Black Shirts, Mussolini's paramilitary organization, were unleashed on the streets of Addis Ababa for 3 days. The killing was indiscriminate, targeting any Ethiopian civilian encountered. The total number of deaths has been estimated at between 3,000 and 30,000, with significant variation across different historical assessments. What is consistent across all accounts is that those killed were overwhelmingly civilians who had no involvement in the assassination attempt. In the days following the street violence, Graziani ordered the systematic arrest and execution of the Ethiopian intellectual and religious leadership, specifically targeting the young Ethiopian men who had received Western education and the monks and priests of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, who represented both spiritual and political authority in the country. The intent was to eliminate any potential future leadership for organized resistance. Back in Italy itself, the regime's system of island confinement, the Confino Islands, developed over the course of the 1920s and 1930s into something considerably more sophisticated and deliberately punishing than its initial conception. The island of Lipari in the Aeolian Islands off the northern coast of Sicily was the first major island Confino facility. By the late 1920s, it held hundreds of political prisoners from across the spectrum of anti-fascist activity: communists, socialists, liberals, anarchists, and in some cases people whose offense against the regime was essentially personal rather than political. The conditions on Lipari were not those of a conventional prison. Inmates were not locked in cells. They lived in the town itself, renting accommodation from local residents, free to move within the island but unable to leave it. This arrangement sounds mild until its mechanics are understood. The confinees on Lipari received a state stipend that was deliberately set below subsistence level, enough to survive on, barely, if nothing unexpected occurred. They were prohibited from working in most occupations. They were prohibited from gathering in groups of more than a small number. They were required to report to the Carabinieri daily. Their mail was read. Any contact with the mainland that could be construed as political activity was grounds for additional punishment, including transfer to a harsher facility or formal criminal prosecution. The psychological design of the system was deliberate. It aimed not at physical destruction, though physical deterioration was common and expected, but at the erosion of purpose, identity, and hope. Men and women who had been active in public life, in politics, in journalism, in labor organizing, found themselves confined to a small island, cut off from everything that had given their lives meaning, watched constantly, and given no indication of when or whether their situation would end. Escape from Lipari was attempted several times, and succeeded in at least one famous case. In July 1929, Carlo Rosselli, a liberal anti-fascist intellectual who would go on to found the organization Justice and Liberty, and become one of the most significant figures in Italian exile anti-fascism, escaped from Lipari by boat with two other confinees, Fausto Nitti and Emilio Lusu. The escape was planned in coordination with contacts on the mainland and was successfully executed in conditions of considerable physical difficulty. The three men reached Tunisia and subsequently made their way to France. Rosselli's escape became a significant embarrassment for the Mussolini regime, which responded by tightening conditions on Lipari and expanding the use of the island of Ponza and later Ventotene for political prisoners. Ventotene in particular became the most isolated and deliberately uncomfortable of the island Confino sites, smaller, with fewer resources, and more distant from the mainland. But Rosselli himself did not ultimately survive the reach of Mussolini's regime. In June 1937, while living in exile in France and continuing his anti-fascist activities from abroad, he and his brother Nello were murdered near the town of Bagnols-de-Lorne in Normandy. The assassins were members of the Cagoule, a French far-right organization, acting on instructions that, as later investigations established, had come from Mussolini's secret service, the SIM. The murder of the Rosselli brothers was an act of state assassination carried out on French soil, and it demonstrated that the reach of Mussolini's repression extended well beyond Italian borders. In 1938, Mussolini introduced racial laws into Italy, legislation modeled in significant respects on the Nuremberg laws that Nazi Germany had passed 3 years earlier. The Italian racial laws stripped Jewish Italians of their citizenship rights, barred them from public employment, prohibited them from attending state schools, and in various ways removed them from participation in Italian civil life. The introduction of the racial laws was not driven by deep popular demand. Italy did not have a strong indigenous tradition of the virulent anti-Semitism that had developed in Central and Eastern Europe. Italian Jews were a small, highly assimilated community with a long history in the country. Some of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe were in Rome and other Italian cities. The racial laws were to a significant degree a political gesture toward Nazi Germany, an alignment with the ideological framework of Europe's most powerful fascist state. The consequences for individuals affected were nonetheless real and severe. Jewish Italians who had built careers in the professions, academia, and business found themselves suddenly excluded. When Italy entered the Second World War in June 1940 on the side of Germany, their situation grew more dangerous by increments. Initially, the Nazi regime's program of systematic mass murder was not directly implemented in Italy. Mussolini's government interned foreign Jewish nationals in camps on Italian soil, harsh facilities, but not death camps. Italian Jewish citizens were not, in the early war years, deported to extermination facilities. This changed fundamentally in September 1943, when Mussolini's government collapsed following the Allied invasion of Sicily and his removal from power by the fascist Grand Council. The German military occupied northern and central Italy almost immediately. Under German occupation, the situation of Italian Jews deteriorated with sudden and catastrophic speed. Between September 1943 and the end of the war in Italy in April 1945, approximately 8,000 Italian Jews were deported to Nazi death camps, primarily Auschwitz. Of these, roughly 7,000 did not survive, The deportations were carried out with active assistance from the Italian Social Republic, the puppet government Mussolini established in northern Italy after his rescue by German forces, and its police apparatus. The racial laws Mussolini had introduced in 1938 as a political gesture created the infrastructure, the documentation, the registration, the categorization that made the deportations of 1943 to 1945 administratively possible. The treatment of prisoners of war under Italian command during World War II is a chapter that sits uneasily alongside the image of Italy as the least brutal of the major Axis powers. The reality, particularly in North Africa and on the Eastern Front, was considerably darker than that image allows. In North Africa, where Italian forces fought alongside German units against British and Commonwealth forces from 1940 onward, the handling of British and Allied prisoners was governed, at least in theory, by the Geneva Convention. Italy had signed the convention and was formally committed to its terms. In practice, the degree to which those terms were observed varied enormously across units, locations, and commanders. The transit of Allied prisoners through Italian hands in North Africa frequently involved forced marches in extreme heat, with inadequate water and food, in conditions that left men in serious physical distress before they reached any formal camp facility. Documentary records from British prisoners captured in North Africa describe the early period of captivity, before reaching any organized camp, as the most physically dangerous of their experience. The Italian prisoner of war camps on the Italian mainland, which held tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth prisoners from 1941 onward, operated at standards that ranged from barely adequate to genuinely harmful. Food was a consistent problem. Italian military rations were themselves inadequate by Allied standards, and what was provided to prisoners was often below even that insufficient baseline. Red Cross parcels were not always distributed as required, medical care was inconsistent, and the physical conditions in some facilities, inadequate shelter, poor sanitation, overcrowding, created environments where disease spread rapidly. The experience of Greek and Yugoslav prisoners in Italian custody was considerably worse than that of Western Allied prisoners. Italy had invaded Greece in October 1940 and Yugoslavia in April 1941, and the populations of both countries faced an Italian occupation that was marked by systematic brutality. Greek and Yugoslav prisoners were not accorded the same nominal protections that Italy applied to Western Allied prisoners. In a number of documented cases, prisoners from these countries were summarily executed rather than taken into formal custody. In Yugoslavia, the Italian occupation regime established a series of concentration camps, the most significant of which was on the island of Rab, off the Dalmatian coast. The Rab concentration camp held tens of thousands of Sloven and Croat civilians, including women, children, and elderly people who had been removed from their homes in areas of Yugoslavia that Italy was attempting to pacify. The mortality rate at Rab was severe. Estimates place the number who died there at between 3,000 and 4,000, primarily from starvation and disease. The camp operated from 1942 to 1943, when the Italian armistice with the Allies led to its dissolution and the release of its surviving inmates. The treatment of prisoners and civilians across the Italian occupation zones in Yugoslavia and Greece was sufficiently documented through both Italian military record and survivor testimony to form the basis of war crimes investigations in the immediate post-war period. These investigations resulted in the compilation of a list of Italian officers and officials accused of war crimes, submitted to the Allied powers by Yugoslavia and Greece. The subsequent handling of that list, and the fate of most of those named on it, is a story of political calculation overriding accountability. When Italy signed its armistice with the Allied powers in September 1943, the political and legal landscape surrounding Italian war crimes shifted almost immediately. Italy was redesignated from an enemy state to a co-belligerent, an ambiguous status reflecting its continued military contribution to the Allied cause. This redesignation had direct consequences for accountability. The Allied powers made a series of decisions that effectively shielded the majority of Italian personnel accused of war crimes from prosecution. The political reasoning was straightforward. Italy was a country the Western powers needed as a stable, pro-Western state in the emerging Cold War. Extensive war crimes prosecutions would destabilize Italian politics, strengthen the Italian left, and complicate the country's reconstruction as an Allied power. The result was the effective shelving of Italian war crimes dossiers. Yugoslavia and Greece had submitted lists of accused individuals, totaling more than 1,200 names, and the evidence had been assembled. In 1965, Italian military authorities placed these files in an armoire in a room of the military prosecutor's office in Rome. The armoire was turned to face the wall. The files remained there, untouched, until 1994, when an Italian judge discovered them in the course of an unrelated investigation. The discovery became known in Italy as the Armadio della Vergogna, the cupboard of shame. The contents documented massacres, the execution of prisoners, the systematic starvation of civilian internees, and chemical weapons use, committed by named Italian officers across Libya, Ethiopia, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Most of the men named had already died by 1994. Pietro Badoglio, who had overseen the Libya concentration camps and commanded the Ethiopian invasion, served as Italian head of government during the 1943 armistice negotiations and was never prosecuted. Rodolfo Graziani was tried by an Italian military court after the war and sentenced to 19 years in prison. He served 4 months before being released. He died in 1955. The concealment represented by the Armadio della Vergogna meant that for decades, the full documented record of what had been done was not available to historians, to the countries affected, or to the public. The full human cost of Mussolini's treatment of prisoners across the Confino camps, domestic prisons, Libyan concentration camps, the Ethiopian occupation, and the Yugoslav and Greek internment facilities has never been compiled into a single authoritative accounting. The historical work of documenting these losses has proceeded unevenly across countries and scholarly traditions. In Libya, documentation of the camp deaths has been shaped by the politics of Italian-Libyan relations across decades of post-war history, including a period of intensive reconciliation under Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, who visited Tripoli in 2008 and offered a formal apology for Italian colonialism, the first such apology by any Italian head of government. In Ethiopia, the wounds of the Italian occupation, including the Addis Ababa massacre, the chemical weapons campaign, and the systematic targeting of the Ethiopian religious and intellectual leadership, have remained a significant part of national memory and have periodically complicated Italian-Ethiopian diplomatic relations. In Yugoslavia and Greece, the documentation assembled in the immediate post-war period was effectively suppressed by the Allied decision not to pursue prosecutions. The communities that had lived under Italian occupation camps and reprisals carried the memory, even as the international framework that might have addressed them was quietly dismantled. Within Italy itself, the confrontation with Mussolini's crimes has been slow and contested. The post-war republic was built on a legal framework of anti-fascism. The 1948 Constitution reflected a deliberate rejection of the fascist state, but the social and political reality included the continuation of many institutional figures who had served the fascist regime. The deep accounting with what the fascist state had actually done developed gradually over decades, driven primarily by academic historians, investigative journalists, and the eventual opening of archives that had been closed. The political prisoners who survived the Confino system left behind memoir, correspondence, and testimony that constitutes one of the most important records of what it meant to live inside a fascist state as an opponent. Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks, written in compressed handwriting on whatever paper he could obtain, smuggled out of prison to eventually reach his sister-in-law, Tatiana Schucht, are the most famous document from this body of material. Published after the war, they became some of the most influential political writing of the 20th century. The survival of that material, the fact that it exists, that it was preserved, that it eventually found its audience, is itself an answer to what the regime had tried to do. The prosecutor who declared his intention to stop Gramsci's brain from functioning for 20 years was correct that the imprisonment destroyed Gramsci's body. He was wrong about the rest. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.